whether it's a recourse or a crisis, and whether it is a situation with the EU which is on the road to integration or whether it is on the road to disintegration. The situation, of course, from a Norwegian perspective is that we are not members of the EU, but for many practical purposes we still are. We seem to be members but without voting rights, which is a very particular and peculiar kind of situation to be in. And of course, Germany being in many ways one of the centers of the EU, if not the center, it's very important to have a debate about Norway as a country outside, but sort of half inside. And of course, the two other German-speaking countries in Europe, Switzerland, being even more outside than we are, and then Austria, which is inside. So it's a situation with three countries which have a different position in relation to EU, and to have a discussion about this, we in the organizing committee of this festival thought would be a very important issue. And it would also give us the opportunity to use the experiences of various intellectuals in relation to how they feel about the EU, how they think about the EU. So that is the background to this debate which we are going to have now, which will last for 1.5 hours, and we have plenty of time. And before we start, I have a few practical things to say. First of all, as you always say in situations like this, there are two exits, one to the left and one to the right, and none in the back. And then, for those of you who are interested in German stories, if you go upstairs on the 3rd floor in the room that's called Nejma, you will find an opportunity to listen to German stories, the histories of writers, etc. And we are going to have an introduction to this debate, which is going to be given by our first speaker who sits here, who is Sten Jørgensen, who is a journalist and a writer, and most of you, I suppose, read Norwegian, will have read his very insightful commentaries in Morgenbladet. And he's going to start by giving an introduction to the whole discussion in 20-25 minutes, and then we will use that as a background to the discussion that we will have together. And the other participants in this discussion are Julia Rabinowitz here, who is an Austrian writer and dramatist, playwright, painter, and also an interpreter, and who originally was not born in Austria, but in Russia, and consequently also has a perspective on what's happening in the European Union and in Europe from another outside position, which I find very interesting to bring in this relation to this. And then our other German speaker is Jonas Lüscher, who is from Switzerland. So then we have the Swiss perspective also inside this. And then the last speaker, and I'm going to give him the floor after Sten Jørgensen, that's our State Secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Audun Halvorsen, who is among others responsible for the Europe desk in the ministry. So please welcome all of them, and I'll try to sort of lead us through this debate as well as I can. And it will be in English, even if this is a German-Norwegian festival. We are in the situation now that while in Europe there are many languages, we all seem to speak with the language which I prefer to call Globish. So please, Sten Inge.
Thank you very much, Helge, and thank you all for being here today. If some of you wonder why the headline of today's topic is so dramatic, it's not only because Europe and the world is in more trouble than before, but it's also because the narrative about Europe has become more dramatic than before. You know the media images, it's like crisis feeding another crisis, etc. And it's very easy to forget that behind all these crisis headlines, the EU is actually quite sound and well in many respects. The community is quite robust. Integration goes on. There's work day to day going on, and I think it's very important to keep that in mind. Also, that according to opinion polls, around 2/3 of the citizens of the European Union thinks that it's a good thing that their country is a member of the European Union. 2/3. It's the highest number in 35 years. And the Union has gained popularity continuously since the Brexit process started. So I think also we should keep that in mind. But we talk about, can the EU become like a global power, or will the EU more or less disintegrate? You know, it's a wide range from one to the other, but still we're going to make that today's issue. And the main reason why we talk about the EU as a potential global power is simply that who else than the EU can step up to the challenges that we are now facing? Who else could it be? The US, China, and Russia, the three biggest powers in the world, are moving in an authoritarian direction simultaneously. The US is undermining the multilateral, institutional, rights-based framework that was built after the Second World War. They seem to want a world where the strength is what matters, not equal rights for everybody. And we see this in so many respects. It's not just that they pull out of the Paris Agreement fighting climate change, but when they refuse to renew the Iran deal, you know, the Iran agreement, which is meant to prevent a new war in the Middle East, they also punish countries and businesses doing business with Iran with sanctions. So they're not only pulling out of international agreements, but they're also actively opposing them. And on the institutional level, the World Trade Organization is now being blocked by the US. They try to sort of make it not work, sort of making it more irrelevant. And why do they do this? Because they feel that as a strong, not just strong, but maybe the only superpower in the world, they have no interest in following all these multilateral rules because they can get a better deal on their own. They want to renegotiate trade deals to get better deals. That's the main task here. When we look at Russia and China, what is common is that they both believe that as big powers, they have spheres of influence where they have a right to intervene. In the Russian case, we know this from several countries in eastern parts of Europe from the last years, and now recently Ukraine, where they have occupied Crimea and they support these rebels in eastern parts of Ukraine. And China is now advancing in the South China Sea. The tension between China and its neighbors is growing by the day because of this. They want to claim more land as Chinese, basically. And while this looks like the traditional way of big power rivalism, that it's about territory, we also see that Russia is fighting a cyber war against Western countries, intervening directly in Western elections. You can see that Trump is now celebrating that. He says it is proved I was not colluding with Russia. But if you read the report, the whole point is that Russia actually maybe secured his victory. And Russia was also involved in the last German election. They want to make Alternative für Deutschland, the far-right party, as strong as possible. How did they do this? Well, they spread fake news about asylum seekers and immigrants raping young German women in social media. And these are just a few or very many examples. I mean, it's not always as obvious as in the case of France, where actually the Front National, or as they now call the new national unity, they are being directly sponsored by Russian banks, and this is actually open. And with this sort of surroundings, it is clear that we have three mega powers that really don't have the same interest in the old institutional system as we Europeans do, because all of us are small countries. Even Germany and the UK, as they are about to realize, and France, even them, of course, without these big institutional frameworks, they could maybe have some more power over smaller European states, but they have not much of a say in global affairs. So what I'm saying is that if this international order is being weakened to a point where it actually starts to, where it doesn't function anymore, then we really are returning to the pre-World War II situation, where it's the right of the strongest that matters. And this is why the EU foreign policy, which is still in its infancy, has as its main explicitly stated target to preserve the international order, democracy, and human rights. This is basically what all European or EU countries agree about. And this is going to be, I think, the major focus for a coordinated EU foreign policy. And but there is another reason also, because if you look at the economic side of things, if you look at the list of the world's biggest economies, the 100 biggest economies, there are not so many countries there as it used to be. More and more big business are there. Take Google, for instance. They have a market value equivalent to the gross domestic product of Austria and Portugal combined. We have almost forgotten that Google is a private company because they are, the gateway to the internet. It's a verb, to Google. And if you're going to do something with these big companies, you need a tremendous strength that no nation states can come up with alone. And this is reflected in the current work of the EU, where you have a commission that is spending more and more of its time trying to stop these multinational companies from becoming too powerful. And you probably heard of the fine that Google was given for tax, unfavorable tax deal they had with Ireland, where they were ordered to pay back 13 billion euros to Ireland. And the EU can do this not because it has competence on tax matters, but because every company are supposed to be treated equally. So they just said, well, Google pays much less tax than other companies, and this is unfair, so they need to pay the same as the others. So this is the way the EU can actually enter this area and actually play a very important role. And I think few of us have realized what the GDPR, the Data Protection Directive that came now, what this really means. What is the meaning of this? It sounds like something you have to learn a bit about to operate a bit safer on the web, but actually it means a lot for the business model of the multinational giants. And the idea of the EU being able to shape the world, to shape law processes in the world, it's not just a dream, and it's not just a fantasy. I mean, in theory, the EU is actually stronger than the US and China because they have a bigger economy. And it is very clear that the UK will be tightly associated with the EU even after a potential Brexit. And it's much easier for the EU to build international alliances than it has been for the US. Simply because the EU is much more popular around the world. A bit bizarre example is Iran, where you can read graffiti on the walls of death over the USA, and it was no kids who put it up, and it was not taken down the day after. When Federica Mogherini, which is the High Representative of Foreign Affairs in the EU, was visiting the Iranian parliament a year ago, the parliamentarians were lining up to take selfies with her. So that's quite a difference. It's like even if the UK and France especially was colonial powers, when they can act through the EU, sort of, they are not so much burdened with that anymore. But the fact that they were colonial powers also means that they have a great network of contacts in other countries around the world. And the EU has a much bigger diplomatic corps, taking all countries together, than the US and China. And we have seen that many important countries in the world have already said that we want to follow the EU's lead in preserving this order that we have today. It's Japan, Canada, Australia, South Korea, to name a few. So the EU has a fantastic potential if it really can come together. And we have many examples that EU law has become a norm for global regulations. Right now, the GDPR, the Data Protection Directive, is spreading. And it is impossible to imagine any other political unit that could create laws which are so detrimental to the interests of multinational companies, and they can implement it without being sanctioned. And thirdly, they can see how this influences other lawmakers around the world. This is what I mean when I talk about, if not the EU, who then? Who could that be? But still, the EU has now common foreign policy in the classical way of seeing it, because they need to vote together. If just one country votes against, then the position of the EU falls. And we see that several countries are then tempted to nurture bilateral ties with US, Russia, and China. And they hope to gain from from blocking EU positions against the interests of these big powers. So I think it is very important that the EU can move to qualified majority voting on foreign affairs, that you can vote down the countries that wants to block these initiatives. And this is where we meet the forces of disintegration. There is an informal alliance, so to speak, between the authoritarian governments in some Central and Eastern European countries and the populists and nationalists in the West. Sverigedemokraterna, Alternative for Deutschland, you have Le Pen in France, you have Lega in Italy. They all fear that the EU will become stronger and more integrated. And exactly like the Polish Law and Order Party and the Hungarian Fidesz Party, they think that that more power to the nation state is the recipe for the future. And actually, they don't have any global agenda at all, maybe except from building walls against the world outside them. But the thing is, they are not in sync with their electorates. They don't have any public support for this, at least no majorities. We see, for instance, that when Europeans are asked directly, do you want Europe to have a more common foreign and defense policy, over 2/3 answer yes, and also a majority in Poland and Hungary and other countries that has more populism or authoritarianism. And it is a myth that the success of parties like Fidesz in Poland or Fidesz in Hungary and Law and Order Party in Poland has something to do with that people backs their anti-EU policies. Today, the EU Commission is launching a survey showing that 75% of the Hungarians, they rate the independence of the courts in the country as bad or very bad. They don't want this. The Poles don't want their judicial system to be demolished. The Poles don't want free press to be constrained. They might be more conservative than the liberal opposition, but they don't want to sort of break away from everything that has to do with the EU at all. And I saw a recent survey, it's hard to believe, it said that actually 90% of the Poles want to remain members of the European Union. I've seen other surveys indicating that it's over 80, and that's also very, very, very high. In the West, the populists and the nationalists' power base is less about the EU than about immigration. But the idea that these forces are now becoming so strong that they can shape European politics is not well-founded. First, you can see that like in the former European Parliament election, they will not gain more than maybe 25% of the votes, and which means that the moderates, they will still have 2/3 majority in the parliament. But then still, if they would try to coordinate, it would be extremely difficult because these parties are so different, and especially on foreign affairs. it's impossible to imagine that Lega in Italy, who wants, to normalize ties with Russia, have closer ties with Russia, can persuade the Polish Law and Order Party to sort of, now we're going to end the sanctions against Russia. I mean, the Poles, they are the most critical to Russia of all. So I think this is really, really understated. We fear some forces that are actually very little integrated and have very different views on the world, but still we treat them like one block. And if I should predict the next 5 years, I think that the populist and nationalist forces, they will continue to struggle a common profile to really play a major political role. And I think the Brexit chaos have shown the European population at large how illusory it is to think about a better future for countries going alone. And we have seen that Syriza party, the radical left in Greece, and also Lega and the Five Star Movement in Italy on the other side, have sort of taken away some of their most Eurosceptic position, like, for instance, their opposition to the common currency. And one thing is they can do this because the population doesn't really demand that they pull out, but also they see the obvious advantages. You can imagine how much interest rate they have to pay on their state debts if they go back to drachmas and liras. Today they pay only 2% because they are strengthened through the big community. Imagine how much of their state budget would have to go to just paying interest rates if they went back to their own currency. Of course they have an interest to stay on. Of course it is much easier to talk bad about the EU cooperation than it is to actually break with it. In any case, if opposition to the EU is not becoming stronger, that doesn't automatically translate into more integration. You need more bold politicians like Macron. And maybe you even need a new generation of politicians that has a more global perspective. In any case, I think that we can conclude that if the EU cannot take a step up onto the global stage, it is not because the European dream is too weak. That is not the fact. That is not supported by surveys among what the EU population really thinks. It is because political leaders in many countries are too obsessed with fighting all their imagined enemies, like immigrants, foreigners, liberal elites, etc. Or it is that they continue to just push traditional politics in their elections. They are really not talking about how dangerous the world is becoming. They are not talking so much about what the real threats to our societies are. They need to do that before we really can go on with the task of building unity on a much bigger and on a European scale. But finally, I also want to note that even if the EU cannot live up to these dreams, it is still a factor that prevents European countries from falling completely into the authoritarian trap. Even Hungary has backed down several times because of pressure from the EU, and the Polish government has done that in even more cases. So I think it is quite fair to say that without the EU, the development in these countries would be far more serious. And the last months I have been traveling to many Eastern and Central European countries, interviewing oppositional editors in newspapers, and they all tell me that without the pressure from the EU, they would have much less protection from their governments. The situation would have been far worse. And there is a global dimension to this, because if there wasn't an EU holding these governments back, it would be much easier for these authoritarian governments to fall into the interest spheres of the major global powers. So you can see that the EU is actually sort of limiting the powers of the global forces, even without playing in the same league as the global powers. And look also to the Western Balkans. Here you find countries that are today as poor as Central and Eastern European countries were in 1990. And the only reason why moderate politicians still play a role in the Balkans is that there is a prospect of a closer ties and maybe a membership in the European Union. If that didn't exist, there would be very different political forces that could take over in these countries. So in this respect, I think the EU already lives up to the dreams of its founders. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this very optimistic overview of the situation. If it had been like that, maybe we shouldn't have had this debate. But I do think it's needed nevertheless, and I think that we probably have some critical remarks to make to your introduction. But before I open up for the floor for a discussion between ourselves here, I would like to give the floor to the State Secretary to give the Norwegian perspective on this, because Norway, as I said, is sort of in a peculiar situation of being inside and outside at the same time. Please.
Indeed. And thank you for the invitation to come here to speak at this extremely, I think, interesting and ambitious festival of literature. I think Sten Inge provided us with an excellent tour of the horizon and the global landscape into which as he describes it, a dramatic narrative about Europe is situated. And I think he's quite right that the narrative is dramatic, but I think that is, at least in part, because the global surroundings are changing, and they are, I think, at least to a certain extent, much more dramatic than they used to be. And that is something that not only states and institutions, but also ordinary citizens are feeling much more strongly than just a few years ago. And in light of that, I would say that the question, as you stated quite clearly, crisis or salvation, so to say, is a bit too binary. But what is quite obvious is that we are living in a time where we have huge transnational challenges that require transnational solutions, at a time where multilateralism as such, on a global scale, on a regional scale, is under pressure and being challenged by a wide range of different forces and actors. We are seeing it in the UN system, in many of the global multilateral institutions. The WTO is one example. But also, of course, on a regional scale, with the EU being challenged also internally by certain countries. And I would say that makes also committed cooperation, both on a global and regional scale, much more important than ever. But that also has the consequence that member states of such frameworks and such organizations must step up to the plates, because these frameworks, these organizations are at any given point in time only what its members make of them. On the regional level, of course, it's the EU. We have the OSCE, we have the Council of Europe, which are also hugely important actors, especially when it comes to human rights, the value-based approach. And as Sten Inge also mentioned, I think that the EU's value-based approach, the strategy that has been one of its most successful historic strengths, one of its greatest export articles, is more important now than ever. And of course, the building blocks are well known. It goes to liberal democracy, human rights, the rule of law, a well-regulated and competitive market economy. And in that sense, the EU is basically the definition of a rules-based order, quite literally, when it comes to the legalistic, formalistic approach. And in that sense, given the global surroundings, I think that the EU remains and has to remain a global example, and also a challenge to some of these other forces that you mentioned, to Russia, for example, which has a completely different system of government and governance. So, a crisis. Are we in a crisis? I would argue that we are not necessarily in a crisis, but even if you say that there is a current crisis in Europe, that is not something new. Going back through history, the EU has experienced and survived and come, I would say, strengthened out of crisis before. Economic crisis with the Euro crisis of 2008, 2009, 2011, stagnation in the 70s and 80s, political crisis in the 90s with the various national opt-outs, and also, of course, the referenda on the constitution in 2005. Integration has always been controversial. We know that very well here from Norway, and it remains so. But we are seeing new trends that are quite worrisome, where you see the opposition to the European project, to the European integration, and to the European model of rules-based, value-based governance being challenged, I think, by an opposition which is much more unified in its messaging. It works across the borders. It is mobilizing in basically all member states in a political climate which is already much more fragmented and much more polarized in the different countries and also on the European scale. Ingen mentioned also how do European citizens actually view the EU? And I think you were using the Eurobarometer polls from late autumn of 2018. And I think they are quite interesting. Because when you poll across the EU member states, 62% see the EU as a positive. 17% see it as a negative. And only in 3 countries is the majority negative or undecided. Those 3 countries are Hungary, Italy, and the Czech Republic. But in no country is the percentage of negative larger than the percentage of positive. 68% of Europeans believe that their countries have benefited from EU membership. 66% say that they would vote Remain if there was a referendum on membership today, with only 17% saying that they would vote Leave. And even support for the euro is at its highest point since 2004. So, on the question of crisis, Luc van Middelaar is a writer, historian, and a former advisor to Council President Herman van Rompuy. He has written a new book. It's called Alarms and Excursions. It's an excellent book. I just bought it. He calls this not a crisis, but he calls it a Machiavellian moment for Europe. This is a moment where Europe realizes that one must fight for legitimacy, for sovereignty, and for an EU which protects itself. So there is a new sense of purpose in Europe, it can be argued, with Brexit, with the migration crisis, with the challenges in the transatlantic relationship, with the growth of China, with the challenges from Russia. And that is, I think, the same sense of purpose that you see informing President Macron's letter to the Europeans, his vision of a Europe that protects, l'Europe qui protège. And if you also look at the policies of the EU and the priorities right now, I think that is translated into policy as well. You have the Commission proposal for the new long-term budget, the multi-annual financial framework, which is being negotiated right now, where you have clear priority to issues such as defense, border control, technology development, versus sort of the old EU priorities of the agricultural policy and the cohesion funds. The development of new tools when it comes to the common security and defense policy, such as PESCO, on defense procurement projects, such as the European Defense Fund on research and development of defense capabilities, and also the EU's new global strategy. And of course, the security relationships, the future security relationships with the UK, which has been a huge contributor to European and EU security, with NATO, much closer cooperation between the EU and NATO than just a few years ago, and also other third countries, such as Norway. Very interesting developments. So I'm quite optimistic, actually, when it comes to the future of Europe as well. I'm sorry to disappoint you, Helge, for the debate. We've seen a Europe that comes back from crisis before, and where actually progress has prevailed. So I would argue that the European dream is not too ambitious. But it needs to be adjusted in line with new challenges and new surroundings. And for Norway, of course, that means that in addition to maintaining a relationship to the EU based on the framework of the EEA agreement, on our national interests, we also equally have to work with the EU, both on the global scale to maintain those same policies and values that we share, but also to contribute to a Europe which is basically our home. So the government launched a new European strategy last year, on the 9th of May, actually, last year, where we have 4 strategic goals or visions for Norway's relationship to the EU. And that is that Norway wishes to contribute to a Europe which is secure, free, economically strong, and responsible, in the sense that there is joint responsibility to address joint challenges. And of course, these are also very much aligned with our own national polities, and they are very closely interlinked. And I would also say that they are very closely connected to Macron's vision of this Europe that protects, and what you're actually seeing developing. It is also clear, I think, in the government platform, the Granavolden platform from January of this year, that it is clearly stated that Norwegian foreign policy starts in Europe. These countries, the member countries of the EU, they are our closest allies, they are our closest trade partners. We have strong economic, political interdependence, and we also have aligned positions on so many global issues. So I think we can come back to the questions of civil society and the challenges sort of internally in the EU. We also have a part to play there when it comes to mechanisms such as the EEA and Norway grants, extremely important in some of these countries. But in general, I think the reality is somewhere in between the crisis and salvation buzzwords.
Thank you so much. Jonas Lysjö, you have worked a lot with nationalism.
Sorry, I have?
Worked with nationalisms.
Yes.
And you have indeed organized a movement against nationalism in Europe, in your home country, in Switzerland, and also in Europe in general. So I would like to ask you a bit about what you view as the threats of nationalism within Europe today, because obviously, I mean, you mentioned Macron having a European perspective in his policies, but Macron is also the president of France, so it's not only a European politician, it's also a politician who has to deal with the challenges of, not least, nationalist movements within his own country. So there are these contradictions within many European countries when it comes to what you could call a new growth of nationalist movements, and at the other time, politicians who want to maintain their European integrationalist perspective. So Jonas, do you have any views on this?
Yeah, maybe let me start by clarifying something in my biography, because I'm not just Swiss, I'm also German. I do live in Germany since like 20 years now, and I became German like 5 years ago. And one of the big reasons why I applied for German citizenship was actually to become a citizen of the European Union. So, and I do live in Germany, so my perspective is actually more German than a Swiss one. Yeah, when we were organizing this thing, it was actually because we were afraid that that these nationalistic tendencies can become bigger. And I am very happy if I hear you talking in this positive way about the EU. I think most of it is absolutely right. But on the other hand, we shouldn't forget that those nationalistic movements can gain strength very quickly if we look in history. And we shouldn't forget that the Front National, like before Macron was voted for, we were pretty sure, or we were all afraid, that the Front National, the Rassemblement National, which is called now, will probably win the presidency in France. It was a huge possibility. And if this would have happened, I think the situation today in Europe would be quite different if we have Le Pen as a French president. So I would say when we think about nationalism, we always kind of have to be very, very careful and not too optimistic. That's what I would say. And that was probably the reason why I started this series of demonstration it was on the 13th of October last year. At the end, it was 54 cities in whole Europe participating. Because actually, today I would also say people who think we have a common future in the European Union are a majority. That's what I would agree. But the nationalists and the right-wing populists, they have a lot of press and a lot of talk about them. We always think they're really strong because they have such a loud voice. So the idea was to go on the streets and to say, okay, we are a majority which believes in a common future in the EU. And we formulated our call for action in a very basic way. We didn't spoke anything about what kind of EU we do want to have. But when he started to organizing and to find partners in all the countries to organize those demonstrations, it appeared quite quickly that this will not work very good, because there was a huge fight between different pro-European groups about working together. And there was a certain part of the left who didn't want to go on the street for the EU at all, especially in France, because in France today, EU, that's Macron's thing. So the French lefts, they don't like to go on the street for the European Union today. We had like those people from Pulse of Europe. I think you have heard about it. It was built in or founded in Frankfurt, but it's now a completely European movement for going on the streets, I think, once a month on Saturday. Many of them are really like liberals, like neoliberals in an economic way. They don't want to go on the street with the lefts. So at the end, we had things like in Frankfurt, there were 2 demonstrations at this day for the same topic. One of like the people, for them, Europe is more like an economic project, and a left-wing demonstration. And that's a huge problem, I think. If we can't agree on like a basic common denominator or something.
But what you're saying now is in many ways kind of, let's call it sorry, yeah. I'm not used to these things. This is kind of parallel to what Sten Inge said, you know, that, oh, it's so difficult to let these populist movements to make them find a common ground, but it's equally difficult for those of us who are opposed to nationalist movements to find a common ground. So in many ways you can say that politically in Europe as a whole, and that's counting both those countries that are within, on the border or without, to find a common ground for actually acting in relation to this. You mentioned this about the left wing in France, for instance, being very reluctant to support the EU. Here in Norway, the left wing is decisively against the EU. Mm-hmm. And there are those of us who think we belong to the left, but still belong to the 20% in Norway who support membership in the EU. But we are a small minority in this country. And this is part of the problem, is that there is no real agreement anywhere when it comes down to what the issues are at the ground. So we can refer to, as you have been doing, to Eurobarometer, etc. But what is really the situation politically when you look at Europe as a whole?
Yeah, maybe just to bring one more point where I'm not very optimistic is when it comes to Germany. Because, I mean, for Merkel, it's probably, in a historic perspective, it's the biggest mistake she ever made during her presidency, that she didn't reach out to Macron when he had his big speech at the university in Paris. But now, with Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, who will most certainly be our next chancellor, it will be probably even a bigger problem, because she is not really... Sometimes she already has this like Thatcherian, I want my money back attitude. So I'm not very optimistic when it comes to the German position.
Yes.
Well, my impression is that when it comes to the factors that hinders more integration, I think this so-called Hansa community is now a bigger obstacle than Germany, with the Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Baltic states, etc. And the role of Germany, I think, will be actually being somewhere in between France and the Hanseatic League. So actually,
Maybe,
they
yeah.
are. So Germany is still with AKK will be more willing to integrate than the Hansa League. So there will sort of be the bridge between them. I agree with you that Merkel could have been, much more contributed much more to what Macron wanted. But still, I see that it's Germany will probably also the next 10 years be more integrationist than the average, I think.
I hope.
One of the issues that have been in the forefront in the past years and have been partly responsible for creating this sense of crisis have been the huge immigration of people from outside the EU. And Julia, you have been working with people coming into as refugees and migrants. So what is your impressions of this situation when it comes to this?
I'm afraid this doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
No, it doesn't sound like that. I'm sorry.
Maybe just take his microphone.
Oh, okay, we just...
Borrow mine.
yeah, I take your voice, sorry.
Don't take my voice, take my microphone.
Okay, I have maybe to explain a little bit how Austria has changed in the past years, because when I started to work with refugees and to translate for them, it was quite, it was quite a time ago, before the big changings at 2015. So I worked not with Syrian refugees, but with Chechens. Fleeing from Chechnya at this point. And at this point, many of the reactions in Austrian society seemed to me very problematic and very hateful. And, Austria changed so much since these days that I'm laughing about my own judgment of the situation at this point, because now it's so much horrible that the state of my refugees, which I was translating, is golden in comparison with what is going on right now. Because at the point when I was working as a translator, it was common sense that Austria would be a humanitarian state, taking the people in, maybe not at the best conditions, but they were taking them in, they were granting them food and lodging, and there were some percent of people hating foreigners, but it was common sense not to be too loud about that. And now, 2019, it changed completely. So at this point, I'm not working as a refugee translator anymore, because the people I translated for are not moving into Austria in these numbers. And I don't speak any language which would be necessary right now. So I just see my colleagues, and I see what they are talking to me about the situation now. And of course, I know my colleagues from the past times, the director of the Caritas in Austria, and so on, and they are really in shock about these changes. So people who we believed then to be conservative, like Christian Konrad, who is now a very big fighter for the rights of refugees. We thought that he was a very conservative guy, not very interesting in their lives at this point. And now, what we thought would be the middle of the political scene, is looked at as if it be very links habe ich auf einmal vergessen. Left, yeah, sorry, that was a blackout. It's a little bit Kafkaesque, the changing of the angle of the view. That what we thought was conservative then is, in a kind of left position now, but it's not a left position, it's just a humanitarian position. And that's what we thought, it would be a conservative way of politics, not a far-right one, but the conservative is leaning to the right more and more. So our chancellor is not speaking against the right-wing party, which he took into power. Our vice-chancellor is able of speaking and doing the awful things which never would have been possible in Germany. So I think that we are moving towards urbanism really quickly, and I'm afraid that the rest of the EU is not looking at that so close as it should be. So right now, as a former refugee, as someone who knows the situation with integration questions, I'm really frightened about what is happening in my country, which I see as my homeland, where I live and love to live. So last year was the first time in my life in Austria when I started to think about moving on. And looking around in Berlin, could I adopt there? Or would it be very strange for me? Because, you know, I spent a lot of time integrating myself, and I like Austria a lot. I believe in Austria, I believe in what it could be. But this picture I have is not very actual anymore. 2 days ago, if we talk about press freedom, one of our most famous interviewers, Armin Wolf, who is very brave and is very, you know, standing ground to the politicians, which are behaving really, really awfully in the last time, and there are many of them. He did an interview with the General Secretary of Freedom Party, and confronting him with a picture they used, which was looking like out of the Stürmer. It was a picture not about Jews, in this case it were Muslims, but they were pictured exactly like the Jews were shown in the Stürmer. And the experts about this confirmed this similarity. So he confronted him and showed him pictures of the Stürmer and pictures of the Muslims his party was using. And this general secretary started to attack him on air. So you could see it in the news in the evening, how he was attacking him and threatening him with consequences of this question. And the scandal on the next day did not happen. It was not a scandal anymore that something like that happened. That's why I'm fearing urbanism moving nearer to us. And that's why I'm completely with you when you say the EU is making some protection in Hungary. So that's a role the EU is playing, I hope, to all its members. And that's one of the main questions as freedom of speech and freedom of art and human rights. That's the stuff which makes the European dream. I apologize. So what happens if we quit this dream? What will happen if we let go? Then Austria will fall into an Orban-like state of being, and I don't think that Austria would be the last country to do so. It's like a domino effect I'm really fearing, but it could be also a positive domino effect, falling in the other direction. So I hope for this.
One of the points that you made, Audun, was that one of the strengths of the EU is the rule of law. That if you look at EU in a world perspective, one of the strengths of the Union is that it maintains a commitment to rule of law, and it's also, as you mentioned, Julia, that there is a sense of the respect for human rights in the EU dream, let's call it that. And personally, I must say, I never thought some years ago that a Christian democratic chancellor of Germany would be the moral voice of Europe, but she was.
She was.
And I think that's a very important point to make, that if you look at the EU in the world today, maybe that's the best strength. And then, of course, we have the other side to this. Is this being undermined by other movements within the EU? Is there a threat to this moral strength that the EU possesses by forces within the EU, but which also, in a way, are related to how citizens of Europe relate to each other? When you were talking, Julia, I was reminded of this fantastic novel by the German author Jenny Erpenbeck, Egen, Gegangen. Has anyone read that? If not, please read it. It's out in Norwegian. And which is about how does one single individual become morally engaged in the issues that have to do with refugees. And this strength of many of the European countries and citizens in Europe, which is a moral strength, is to me a very important element in this. So I don't know whether you have any views on that, because this has to do with the fundamentals of what we think of Europe.
But you know, I just have to interrupt a little bit, and then I stop at the moment. You know, when people are drowning outside our borders, we have to see that and react on that properly. So if we want to be a moral instance, how can this happen? That's one of the questions the EU has to solve in itself.
Well, that is one of the contradictions, I think.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
Audun, do you have a comment to this? You were the one who brought this moral element up.
Always difficult for a politician. No, I don't want to turn this into a migration debate. I don't think that is fruitful for the debate on Europe as such. But and I would also argue that you can discuss sort of the finer points of the policies of 2015 in the different European countries, and also Chancellor Merkel's response and the consequences of that very clear, as you say, choice and voice. But of course, looking at this from the EU institutional perspective, and also bringing in Schengen, of course, the free movement of people within such a system depends on the control of the borders of that system. And I think that has been, part of the paradox that we have been facing. And it's also easy, even only 3.5 years later, to underestimate sort of the trauma that European countries and leaders and citizens experienced in the migration wave in the autumn of 2015. More than 1 million people to Germany, 30,000 people to Norway, so within the scope of 2.5 months. That was a huge challenge. And I think really migration is one of the issues that can really still tear Europe apart if we let it, and if we don't find better common solutions to the problem that also need to include stronger border control and management. But going back to this question of the values-based approach and the moral strength, I think what we have been seeing over the last years in certain countries is a development that it just wasn't foreseen when you built the EU institutions. You had a belief that once you were on the inside, you would never challenge sort of that approach. This, as I said, was one of the strongest export articles and one of the pull factors to the EU, looking at Eastern Europe, for example. But of course, once that system is challenged from within, and you don't have the necessary mechanisms and sanctions to meet that kind of those policies and that behavior from member states, it becomes extremely difficult. But of course, we have seen reactions. Then Ingen mentioned that you have seen judgments in the European courts, for example, that has been basically been followed by Poland, for example. You are seeing now the so-called Article 7 procedures, And also now a discussion on the issues of conditionality when it comes to some of the financial mechanisms, conditioned upon rule of law and civil society freedoms, etc. But it's basically catching up to a development, I think, that was not foreseen by any of the European politicians when the system was introduced and expanded.
Does this mean that, and this is a question both for you, Stenning, and for Jonas, do you see this in relation to that there is a strengthening feeling among both government and people and voters in Europe that while they are members of Europe, they're also definitely Frenchmen, Austrians, Germans, Swedes, Austrians, etc., and that there is a kind of a lingering contradiction between being a European and a citizen of a country, because this question of being your rights are, after all, related to being a citizen of a country. This is incredibly important. And you said you had shifted citizenship because you wanted to be a citizen of the EU. And this citizenship business is a very sensitive issue, and we see it in the Brexit debate very clearly. I don't know whether you have any questions, answers to that.
Well, I think that if you look at the surveys who ask Europeans about their identity, you will find that the UK is in a very special position. I mean, you have sort of three possible answers when they call you on the phone, and that is, I have a national identity, I have a national and European identity, or I have a European identity. And what you see is that a big majority everywhere have both a national and a European identity. But in the UK, it's over 89% or something says they have only a national identity. And that has to do, of course, with the history of the UK as this global power.
Do they answer that when they're in Scotland or when they are in England?
Good question. I haven't seen the numbers broken down. But still, well, all those who have a European identity are probably the Scots then. But no, so this is, these numbers sort of gives confidence to those who believe that the nation state is not in contradiction to the European project. But as you say, you know, the citizenship and immigration is challenging this in a way. And it's not only because of traditional migration or about refugees, but today you also see that rich people from all over the world, they buy a residency in European countries. If you have enough money, you can buy a residency. And but I think the refugee situation and the immigration situation, if you look at it combined, I don't see any good national solutions to it. And I think that even the countries that have tried national solutions, they are uncertain about the value of it. Denmark, for instance, last year, they spent, I just heard the numbers today, they spent 387 million on border controls on persons the last year, stopping 7,600 people, which is equivalent of 5,000 euros per person to stop one person on the border. And I mean, you need to go all the way like Hungary to build fences, and you need policemen walking with dogs in the forests. I mean, this is not a Europe. No majority wants a Europe with borders like this. So what you will see, what there is agreement about, is a strengthening of Frontex, of the outer borders of the European Union. According to the Commission's plan, there will be 10,000 people in a couple of years that will be ready to assist countries that cannot control their own borders anymore. So, I mean, this is not necessarily people who are placed around to stop people from getting in, but they can help countries that are overwhelmed. And this, I think, is necessary, even though it sounds horrible. You know, it sounds horrible that we are in a situation where we actually need border controls to protect ourselves from migrants and refugees. And this is it's extremely controversial topics. There are so many. We could have several days seminars about this, you know, if it is needed or not. But go to Greece, go to a country that was totally overwhelmed by these inflows. And ask Greece if they think that the EU should have helped them more, and they will say yes. And Italy will definitely want more help. France, several times the last years, has moved soldiers to the Italian border because they think that Italians are not good enough on controlling immigrants moving north through Italy. I mean, so this situation is so tense, and to find a common European solution is absolutely crucial, I think.
Jonas?
Yeah, maybe I come back to this conflict between nationality and European identity. I have the feeling that for many young people, especially young people, it's quite easy to have multiple identities or something like a fluid identity. Or it even was something earlier on also conservatives didn't have a problem with. I remember that Franz Josef Strauss, I don't know if you remember him, he was the really conservative Bavarian minister president, and he said once, I think it was, my home is Bavaria, my country is Germany, my future is in Europe. So that was one of the most conservative politicians in the 70s. Yeah? And today, I think that this fight between national identity and European identity is often something made up or like lighten up by right-wing or populist politicians. But it is also, I'm afraid, a bit a question of milieu, because I think that many young people, like highly educated, studying in whole Europe, traveling around a lot, and for them it's like the EU, it's like a reality, something they experience every day, it's very natural. But what we sometimes forget is that we maybe leave a certain group of people behind there. And that's something I think we should have a very strong view on it, that we could make Europe more of a reality also for people who don't study, who don't travel a lot, or even to, something like this. That would be, I think, very important.
And these groups are also the basics for many of these populist movements.
Sure, yeah.
I was thinking about something you said, Stenning, about Europe and playing a role in a wider international frame in relation to China, US, and Russia, and saying that your analysis of this was that EU would be the only ability, the only possibility we had for maintaining a kind of democratic alternative to these other more authoritarian systems, or more, what shall we call it, gross capitalistic systems. China is a very peculiar kind of system, right? Grossly capitalistic and grossly authoritarian at the same time. And you were saying that here there was an opportunity for the EU to play a role. But at the same time, I've been working a lot with, I've done research on China and Africa. And what you see now is that China has an enormous push and pull in Africa. And much more than where the competition is not so much US, but the competition is in addition to the EU, India and Japan. So you see that EU is not only related to a competition between the other big powers, but also to the new growing powers, which you see in the so-called BRICS movement, which you also see in the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which is now encroaching on Europe. Italy has joined the Belt and Road, and now yesterday I saw that Portugal is also going to be part of the Belt and Road Initiative.
I think the advance of China in Africa has many reasons. Only a minor being that the EU is not coordinated in any meaningful respect there. But I think that when you talk about that there are also other countries, not just China, many others, and of course you will never see an EU that is sort of the sole idealistic defender of some humanitarian, non-commercial principles or interests. I mean, the reality is that the EU countries are in a global competition situation and will continue to be that.
But they also compete. They also compete between themselves.
Oh yes, they do, and they have even tax havens in between themselves, even though they state that they are fighting tax havens. So the list of contradictions is very long. But I think that if you ask more like independent voices who study, for instance, the situation in developing countries, they will say that because a company comes from the EU, we prefer this country over, for instance, a Chinese or an American country to operate here because they have to follow stricter standards on environmental concerns, labor rights, transparency in the contract, not least. I mean, look at all the corruption in many of these countries. So compared with the others, the EU is actually better. That's my point.
I also just heard another meaning. Somebody told me from Nigeria, he thinks he's happy that the Chinese are coming because they have no colonial history. That's, yeah.
And no conditions
Point.
when it comes to anti-corruption.
The Chinese do not come with conditionalities, that's true. But the reason why I ask this question is that while we talk about this European integration, it's quite difficult to find a common European foreign policy. Julia?
I just want to say that we were talking about authoritarian systems growing newly in Europe. And I think we have to remember that it's not so long time passed since authoritarian regimes has been taking place in Europe. I have experienced authoritarian regime myself. So I grew up my first 7 years into one. I know how it feels like. I know how discussions are not possible in these systems. So if you say there are these discussions turning Europe apart, I see on the other side, these discussions and these different opinions are on a part not very helpful, but they are a sign of free thinking and the freedom of speech too. So they are not only negative, and we never should lose this remembrance of how it could be when it's not like this anymore, because it's starting to grow again. And, that's not really about foreign policy. I just wanted to react on you too. And of course, a foreign politics of the EU would be better if we would stay in one position altogether, and we are not there yet. And you are not very optimistic about that, as I understood. I try to be alerted but optimistic.
Yeah,
because
I
still
would
we are
agree
free.
to that.
Yeah?
Okay, Audun, you wanted to say something?
Yeah.
No, just an observation. Of course, the question of a common foreign policy has been haunting the EU for decades.
Yes.
And of course, over the years, you have taken steps. You have established the institutions, the EAS, the Office of the High Representative. You have, on some policy areas, you have, I would say, a good alignment on the policies and on the tools. And on others, more sensitive, controversial issues, it all sort of falls apart. And of course, we see that on many issues. But of course, also, if you look at the EU member countries, among the countries, there is still a lot of shared policies and positions when it comes to international questions. So I think for Norway, working both with the EU as such, with the EAS, and also with the member countries, remains critically important. But in light of what I said also earlier, I think this is one of the points where you are seeing a wish, or at least among many EU countries, for a strengthened common policy. You're also seeing the Commission has proposed some new financial instruments for foreign policy development in their news or their suggestion for the new framework, and also this strengthening of the defense pillar, for example, and the CSDP is part of that same picture in trying to establish a stronger framework for that joint policy.
Jonas, what do you think?
On the idea of the foreign policy,
Is there a possibility for a common foreign policy in the EU?
I think there is a possibility, and it's a necessity, absolutely. I think on the long run, because of all the things you said in your speech you had, I mean, all those big geopolitical changes we are experiencing now, we can't react on them on the basis of countries. Even, and this was a very good point you made, even bigger European countries like France and Germany wouldn't be able to really be a strong force in a world like we have it now. So it's just a necessity, and I think sooner or later we will reach an agreement to a common foreign policy. I'm just afraid that maybe it's
Sooner or later.
it will be later.
But we are talking about this as, in a way, there is a common ground in the EU. And then, on the other hand, the differences between the states that form the union are quite considerable, and they're also quite heavily expressed in many of the debates within the EU. And as we are now approaching a European election to the European Parliament, we will see probably, you were saying that, well, we would have a majority which would be sort of the liberal center in the new parliament. But that again points in the direction of what kind of parliament are we really talking about in relation to this? As we are not a member of this parliament, what kind of parliament is this? Is it a parliament in this in the traditional sense of the word? Or what is it really? And what is the interest in the elections to the parliament? The participation in the elections is quite low all over Europe.
I think it would be, the interest in the European Parliament would be greater or bigger in the moment when we have more like a common foreign policy, a European one. Because right now I think many people don't even really know what the Parliament is deciding, except of all this, you know, the myth about cucumbers and toilet paper regulations and stuff like this, which is always like something people are talking about. But then we also have the problem with the Council of the European Union, which has a strong position right now, which is not really, I think, a good idea, because it's not really a democratic, or not as democratic as I would wish it would be. So I hope we can make certain changes in this direction and give the Parliament even more possibilities or more power. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that many would object when you say the council is not democratic, because it's, you know, it's still the governments, elected governments of every country, and I think we'll be talking about that those who want a stronger EU are sort of split. And what you point to there is exactly one of these splits, because you have those who want the EU to move in a more federal direction with a much stronger parliament, and then you have those who want to remain with a Europe of nations primarily. You know, with the council should be as strong as possible. And in the current situation, I see that the federalist forces are weaker than in a long time. So I think the council will have to play the major role, continue to do that for a long time. But that doesn't mean that integration has to stop, because it is also the council that consists of the politicians that feel that the interests of their own nation states are sort of threatened by the global challenges. So they have a huge interest of coming together and finding some solution, and they will get huge backing from the parliament in all those initiatives. So I think that would be, you know, even though, as I agree with you, you know, the elected governments on a European scale, they are not necessarily thinking about the best of Europe. So you have a point. Yeah.
I mean, I think that moving in a more federalistic direction could only work if we keep the idea of, is it subsidiarity in English too? Yeah, subsidiarity. If we keep that really strong and high, then I think it can work. Yeah.
I was thinking about something that you said, studying, namely about relationship between national economies and the economies of the big corporations, and the role of the EU in relation to that. And you mentioned the Data Protection Directive, but I was recently passed a new directive, namely the Digital Directive, which is also very important in relation to this. That maybe if we look at Europe and the European Union in a perspective of curbing the worst aspects of this new corporate capitalism, maybe that's where the most optimistic part of a new European policy might lay.
I think if you look at the direction the Commission has taken on the Juncker, it is in line with the Europe who protects, as Macron wants, and particularly on the social dimension, because you see new directives coming, or they are being reformed and changed to have a more social profile than they used to. And you see that the Commission also explicitly attacks big companies' hiring practices, because I mean it's not within the competence of the Commission to tell a company which contract can you give an employee. That's not really the competence, but still it is because there is a law saying that there should be equal rights for everybody who has sort of an engagement with the company. So what the Commission does now is to fight the trend where young people don't get regular full-time jobs all over Europe, particularly in the countries that was hardest hit by the crisis, like in Italy and Spain. You will see that on paper the unemployment figures are looking really good now, but if you look behind them and see what kind of jobs these people get, it's not full-time, it's basically many of them don't know what they're doing the next month. And so this was something the EU started with the directive on the hiring agencies, where they said that if you hire somebody to replace an ordinary employee, then the new one should have the same salary, the same rights to leave, the same rights when she or he gets sick, etc. So what you do is you make it so expensive not to hire somebody that the advantage of speculating in this is becoming less and less. And there are so many examples of this happening now. And I think this is definitely the way to go, because then you can sort of you can make the labor market better and more fair for the citizens without harming the competition of your own country's business, because these rules are going to be Europe-wide. So all the main competitors also will have to give their employees better conditions. And the reason that the EU can do this, even in a situation where center-right governments are in majority, is of course not only because also center-right governments cares about the social dimension, at least they do. I mean, maybe not so much as the socialists would do, but still they see that when the populist forces are becoming stronger, that is partly because the system, what you can call the system with the economy, is not as fair as it used to be. And that if you're going to stop these populist forces from taking more votes, then you can make the social system a bit more fair. So the EU can become a tool for moderate politicians to also gain some more voters again.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this was a good place to stop this debate. As this is a literature festival, I'm going to make a commercial for a book about the EU. It's written by an Austrian writer whose name is Robert Menasse, who has written a fantastic book about Brussels called Die Hauptstadt. It's out in German, English, Swedish, Danish, but unfortunately not in Norwegian yet. But that's partly maybe the reason why we are having this festival, that we think that far too few German language books are being brought into Norway and translated into Norwegian. And this book is a book not only about the EU, but it is about that. It's also a book about Brussels, and it's about a book about European history. So go and read Die Hauptstadt by Robert Menasse. And thank you all for this very interesting debate. And I'm not here in the official position, so I hope that Norway will join the EU.